It was a Thursday evening, the kind that settles in quietly, with the air crisp and the sky already dark by 6. In the small town of Maple Hollow, Pennsylvania, the leaves had begun their slow descent into color and decay, and the houses on Sycamore Lane stood in neat rows, their porch lights flickering on as the wind picked up. The Miller residence, a 2-story colonial with white shutters and a swing hanging from the front tree, looked like any other suburban home, safe, ordinary, forgettable. That night, Michael and Dana Miller had a fundraiser to attend, a local charity gala hosted at the community center 20 minutes away. It was formal but small, the kind of event where everyone knew everyone, and appearances mattered. Their 2 children, Olivia, age 6, and Thomas, age 3, were too young to sit through hours of speeches and socializing, so they called the girl they'd been using for over a year, Emily Carter. Emily was 17, soft-spoken and dependable. She was known for being responsible, always on time, and never on her phone too much around the kids. She lived 2 streets over and had babysat for the Millers at least a dozen times before. Dana left a list of emergency numbers on the fridge and ordered pizza before heading out. By all accounts, it was routine. Nothing about that night stood out. According to text records, Emily had messaged her mom at 8:17 p.m. to say that the kids were in pajamas and watching a movie. That was the last message she ever sent. At exactly 11:06 p.m., the Millers pulled into their driveway. The porch light was still on, and the house was quiet. Michael opened the front door, which was locked, using his key. Inside, the living room was dim but orderly. Pillows in place, TV off, toys collected in their bins. Dana went upstairs to check on the kids. Both were sound asleep in their beds. Their bedroom doors had been left ajar, the hallway nightlight glowing softly. Nothing seemed wrong, until Dana noticed Emily wasn't in the guest room where she usually waited. Her coat still hung on the rack near the door. Her backpack was against the wall. Her phone sat on the kitchen counter plugged into the charging cable. But Emily was nowhere in the house. At first, they assumed she had gone outside, maybe stepped onto the porch to take a call or grab something from her car. But when Michael opened the front door again, the porch was empty, and Emily's car was still parked at the curb. The back door was checked, locked from the inside. Every room was checked again. The closets, the bathrooms, even the garage. Nothing. Not a sign of struggle, not a sound. Dana tried calling Emily's phone despite it being right in front of her, as if something might suddenly ring back. She didn't pick up. At 11:24 p.m., Michael called 911. The first responding officer arrived within 10 minutes. His name was Officer Greg Hansen, a 20-year veteran of the Maple Hollow PD. In his incident report, he noted the unusual stillness of the home. There were no open windows, no footprints, and no signs of a break-in. Emily's belongings were all accounted for. Her ID was in her wallet, and her car keys were on the kitchen hook where she always left them. She hadn't taken her jacket, and it was in the low 40s that night. Dana explained that Emily had never left the kids alone before. Never, not even to walk down the street. That she was the type to double-check the locks, leave notes, and clean up before the parents got home. She wouldn't have left without saying something. By midnight, 2 more officers had arrived, and the house was cordoned off. Officers began logging what they saw: a half-finished cup of tea on the dining table, a folded blanket on the couch, a puzzle halfway completed on the floor. All signs of normal life. Interrupted. Investigators spoke quietly as the Millers sat on the stairs, confused and increasingly alarmed. Donna kept repeating that Emily had always been so careful, and Michael kept asking if maybe she'd gone to check on the kids and accidentally fallen asleep somewhere in the house. But every closet, every crawl space, every cabinet had been searched. At 1:06 a.m., detectives officially filed Emily Carter as a missing person. Word spread quickly the next morning. Maple Hollow was small. Local parents texted each other in hushed tones, and Facebook lit up with speculation. Some believed Emily had run away. Others feared something darker. Her parents were brought in for questioning and said she'd been in a good mood earlier that day, excited about her upcoming college applications and a weekend camping trip with her best friend. There was no indication she was troubled. Her phone had no unusual activity. Her location tracking stopped transmitting around 9:46 p.m. while still inside the Miller home. Outside, the wind had picked up. Leaves scraped across the sidewalk in slow spirals. A search party was organized. Neighbors volunteered to canvass the surrounding blocks. But no one could answer the question hanging in the air like static. How does a girl vanish from a locked house without a trace? And why would she leave everything behind, including the children she cared for? What began as an ordinary Thursday night had just become the beginning of a case that would consume the town for months to come, and leave investigators chasing a mystery buried deeper than anyone imagined. Detectives returned to the Miller house the following morning, this time with crime scene technicians and a renewed sense of urgency. The missing persons report had escalated quickly into a full-scale investigation. Nothing about Emily Carter's disappearance aligned with typical runaway cases, and now with 12 hours lost, every detail inside the house had to be treated as potentially significant. Officers walked through the home again, methodically, starting at the front entryway, then moving room to room. Dana Miller stood by nervously, arms crossed tightly, answering questions as best she could. Michael hovered behind her, expression unreadable. In every room, the story was the same. Everything was in place. No broken windows, no signs of forced entry, no blood, no screams had been heard. The home was neat, orderly, and preserved in time from the moment the Millers had arrived home the night before. But when Detective Erica Lang stepped into the hallway near the kitchen pantry, she noticed something subtle. The basement door, white with scuff marks along the bottom, was cracked open about 4 inches. Not wide enough to notice at a glance, but enough that she paused. She turned to Dana, who immediately froze. According to her, that door was always shut. Always. With 2 young kids in the house, the basement had been off limits unless an adult was present. Michael confirmed it too. They were adamant. That door should have been closed and latched. Yet there it was, slightly open, just enough to suggest someone had gone down or tried to come back up. Detective Lang called over one of the techs, and the team prepared to descend into the basement. There were no lights on below, so they used handheld torches. At first glance, the basement looked typical. Exposed wooden beams, boxes stacked along the walls, and an old washer-dryer unit humming in one corner. But just as they reached the base of the stairs, one officer spotted something lying beside the 4th step from the bottom. A black flashlight, small, handheld, the kind often carried on a keychain or tucked into a jacket pocket. It was scuffed along one edge and cold to the touch. When they tried to turn it on, nothing happened. The batteries were dead. Back upstairs, Emily's mother confirmed during questioning that Emily always brought a flashlight when babysitting. It was part of a little safety kit she carried, a compact, no-nonsense collection of items, Band-Aids, tissues, an extra phone charger, and pepper spray. It was something she'd started doing after attending a self-defense seminar at school. That flashlight, lying there at the bottom of the stairs, wasn't just a flashlight anymore. It was the first tangible sign that Emily had made it into that basement. Technicians scanned the basement floor, which was bare concrete with visible dust along the perimeter where no one typically walked. After several hours and layers of fingerprint dusting, one of them found faint impressions, partial shoe prints. They appeared near the far corner of the basement, where several old pieces of furniture were covered in cloth and stacked together. The impressions were light and smudged, almost as if someone had stepped, paused, then dragged their foot slightly. There were no clean outlines, no definable threads, but they were human-sized. They didn't match the shoes of the officers who had entered, and they weren't from the Millers, who both wore slippers that morning. The prints were too vague to confirm a match, but they were enough to raise new possibilities. Maybe Emily had gone into the basement for something, heard a sound or followed one. Maybe she slipped, or maybe someone was already down there. The theory of an accident began to take shape. The flashlight could have dropped during a fall, but there were no bloodstains, no disturbed furniture, and more importantly, nobody. The officers brought in a portable black light and checked every corner for fluid traces. They found nothing. Still, the footprint markings wouldn't let the idea go. Emily had been down there, but what happened next? If she had slipped or been hurt, where was she? And if someone had come into the house, how did they get in, and how did they leave if the doors were still locked? Detectives returned to the exterior of the house. They inspected the basement windows, small rectangular panels positioned along the top of the concrete foundation. One of them, positioned near the back of the house behind a bush, had scratch marks on the sill. Not fresh, not conclusive, but enough to warrant further analysis. The window itself was shut and locked from the inside. The latch was dusty but undisturbed. Still, if someone had known the layout, they could have slipped through, especially if the window had been left open and later closed again. It was now a question of whether this was a one-time incident or if someone had been watching the house for longer. Later that evening, detectives canvassed the neighborhood for doorbell cameras or security footage. One house 3 doors down had a Ring camera facing the street, but the footage between 8 p.m. and midnight showed no movement around the Miller house, no unusual cars, and no figures in the yard. Emily hadn't walked outside, no one had entered visibly. And yet, she was gone. Back in the Miller basement, officers chalked small marks where the faint prints had been. They logged the location of the flashlight, tagged the cloth-covered furniture, and noted the pattern of items on the shelves. They took photos from every angle, but the room gave them nothing else. No sounds, no signs of a break. Just a quiet, unfinished space that seemed to swallow their questions whole. As Detective Lang locked up for the night, she paused again by the basement door. She stared at it, thinking of the time it was found ajar, thinking of how little it took for someone to vanish, just one door left open, one step in the wrong direction. Emily's flashlight was now sealed in an evidence bag, but its presence lingered in everyone's mind. She had made it down those stairs. The question was, did she ever come back up? By the second full day of the investigation, the case had already taken a shape that made investigators uncomfortable. There was no forced entry, no break-in, no signs of a struggle, nothing missing, no obvious motive. Just a 17-year-old girl who vanished from a locked home with her coat still on the hook and her car untouched at the curb. Detective Lang and her team ran down every angle, but the physical evidence kept circling back to the same dead end. Every door had been locked from the inside, every window sealed. The only open entry was the slightly ajar basement door, and even that led nowhere they could prove. Emily Carter had disappeared into silence, and the silence wasn't giving anything back. On Saturday morning, investigators went door to door, asking for any home surveillance footage from Thursday night. Most houses in the neighborhood were equipped with at least one Ring camera or security light, especially after a string of petty thefts over the summer. One neighbor, 2 houses west of the Millers, had a Ring camera mounted above their garage. The angle captured the Millers' driveway and part of their front porch. The owner, a retired corrections officer named Warren Little, handed over the footage without hesitation. Officers reviewed it in real time on a department laptop. From 6 p.m. to 11 p.m., the clip showed the Millers leaving, followed by quiet. No vehicles approached, no unusual foot traffic. At 11:06 p.m., their car returned, headlights sweeping across the yard. Nothing else. No one was seen entering or exiting the house, no glimpse of Emily outside, no signs of anyone lingering in the yard. It was as if time had skipped straight over her. Inside the precinct, detectives questioned Emily's boyfriend, Noah Grant, a senior at her school. He was visibly shaken, pale, and couldn't stop tapping his foot during the interview. He told police he last saw her around 3:30 p.m. on Thursday, before she left to babysit. They'd texted that evening, nothing unusual. She'd sent him a selfie with the kids and a text saying, "They're little chaos goblins tonight, but sweet. Miss you." That was at 8:01 p.m. He responded a few minutes later, but she didn't reply. He hadn't thought much of it at the time. Sometimes she fell asleep early at the Miller's house, but by Friday morning, when her mom called asking if she'd slept over at his place, panic began to creep in. He told them Emily would never run away. She was planning for college and had just submitted an application to Penn State. She had a weekend trip lined up with her best friend. Everything in her life was moving forward. Police followed up with Emily's inner circle, her best friend Marissa, a few classmates from AP English, and one teacher. They all said the same thing. No drama, no arguments at home, no signs of depression. Her phone, pulled for analysis, showed no deleted messages or calls. The only unusual behavior was her location history stopping at 9:46 p.m. inside the Miller house, but that wasn't unexpected if the phone was stationary and charging. The last app she used was Spotify, cueing a lullaby playlist for the children. Nothing else stood out, but outside the immediate circle, the theories were already spreading. Social media became a minefield. On the town's Facebook group, threads multiplied overnight. Some speculated Emily had left on her own. Others accused the Millers. A few posts suggested she might have been lured by someone online. The local subreddit lit up with rumors, some claiming she'd been spotted at a bus station in Altoona, others that she'd made posts under a fake account about wanting to escape. None of it was verified, and none of it held up under scrutiny. The Altoona bus station had no surveillance footage of her. The supposed burner accounts led nowhere. Detectives combed through dozens of usernames and message logs, but came away with nothing concrete. To eliminate all other possibilities, police launched a ground search. Starting Saturday afternoon, over 60 volunteers joined law enforcement in combing the nearby woods behind the Miller house, stretching into the undeveloped parcels near Old Creek Road. They searched drainage ditches, storm culverts, and even shallow well covers. Nothing. K-9 units were brought in and picked up a trace scent near the backyard fence, but quickly lost it near the tree line. The dogs didn't indicate anything beyond that. No shoe prints, no torn fabric, no signs of distress. Every possibility was considered: coyote attack, a fall, disorientation. But those outcomes usually leave something behind. A torn piece of clothing, blood, anything. By Sunday, a helicopter unit from the state police was deployed with infrared to scan for heat signatures across a 3-mile radius. Again, nothing. Emily Carter had vanished so completely, so cleanly, that it defied logic. There wasn't a single usable witness. Not one neighbor recalled hearing screams. No one noticed suspicious activity. No unfamiliar vehicles were reported, not even a stranger casing the neighborhood. It was as if she had been there, and then she wasn't. Investigators circled back again to the house, trying to identify anything missed. Detective Lang had crime scene techs double-check the entryways, the crawl spaces, and the attic. They even lifted carpet padding upstairs, tested soil samples from the garden, and reviewed electrical panel logs. But they found no surge, no breaker trip, no flicker, no explanation. The official press conference that evening gave little hope. A department spokesperson asked for tips and assured the public that no possibility was off the table. The town, once known for its sleepy safety, suddenly felt smaller and more dangerous. Emily's parents pleaded for information, standing in front of cameras with trembling hands and red-rimmed eyes. They begged anyone who might know anything to speak up. By Monday morning, Emily's photo was posted in every diner, gas station, and grocery store in the county. Her school placed a candle and framed photo near the entrance. But without new leads, the case began to settle into a painful holding pattern, the kind that families dread. Not a recovery, not a closure, just the soundless circling question: how does a girl disappear without ever leaving the house? By Tuesday morning, the investigation had started to teeter into a space detectives dreaded, an active case with no clear direction. Emily Carter had now been missing for nearly 5 days. The media pressure was growing, the community was becoming restless, and internally, the case file was swelling with pages that all pointed to the same thing: nowhere. That's when a new tactic was approved. A K-9 unit from the state's forensic team was brought in, this time with cadaver dogs. Unlike search and rescue dogs, these animals weren't trained to find a living person. They were trained to detect human decomposition, even in the earliest stages, and even through layers of flooring or foundation. If Emily was still inside the house, alive or not, this was the method that might find her. The dogs arrived late Tuesday afternoon, 2 German shepherds handled by experienced officers who had worked homicide and disaster recovery across the state. The house had already been cleared and locked down, and the Millers were asked to step outside. The handlers moved with quiet precision, letting the dogs roam each room while recording timestamps and behavior patterns. Upstairs, the dogs showed no reaction, same with the children's rooms, the attic, and both bathrooms. But when they reached the basement stairs, both dogs paused. Not a dramatic alert, no barking or scratching, but a shift in posture. Heads down, noses working the air, tails stiff. One dog slowly descended the stairs while the other followed, pausing halfway down. Inside the basement, the air was cold and still. The team moved along the walls, furniture, and exposed beams. The dogs sniffed around the laundry machines, the old chest freezer, and the storage bins. Then, near the southwest corner of the basement, one of the dogs suddenly tensed and sat. That posture meant something specific, an alert. The second dog followed, circling twice before also sitting, nose pointed toward the drywall. The section in question was old, unevenly painted, and extended behind a row of stacked storage totes and broken-down holiday decorations. Behind it was a sealed crawl space, partially walled off during a renovation the Millers had started over a year ago and then abandoned. Detective Lang stood behind the handler, taking notes as they marked the wall with chalk and tagged it for further analysis. The immediate assumption was that the crawl space held something, either Emily herself or some trace evidence of her presence. The air was tested for trace gases linked to decomposition, but levels were inconclusive. Still, the alert from both dogs couldn't be ignored. Investigators called in a specialist team from the crime lab to bring in ground-penetrating radar, GPR, a device capable of scanning through concrete and walls to detect voids, structural anomalies, or buried material. It wasn't a perfect science, but in the absence of visible evidence, it was the next step. The scan began just before dusk. The team positioned the antenna along the wall, moving in slow, overlapping lines. The software rendered a black and gray image in real time, highlighting any differences in material density behind the surface. The results, however, were frustrating. The wall behind the alert area didn't register any significant voids. No pockets of disturbed soil, no signs of a recently dug chamber or unusual shift in structural layout. It showed studs, concrete, and insulation, nothing more. Still, the dogs had alerted there. That wasn't something they did lightly. The team debated whether to open the wall anyway. Detective Lang pushed for it, citing the dog's behavior. But the property was still legally the Millers' residence, and without a physical anomaly or warrant-supported probable cause, tearing into the walls would open the department to liability. Instead, the space was measured, cataloged, and added to the list of high-interest areas. Samples were taken from the drywall and surrounding foundation, but again, lab analysis returned neutral results. With no body, no biological material, and no secondary confirmation from GPR, the theory remained just that, a theory. Still, it was enough to shift the emotional tone of the investigation. If Emily had entered that crawl space, had she been trying to hide, or was someone trying to hide her? Was it possible she had been pulled into the space and then moved later? The questions multiplied, but answers remained absent. Out of caution and growing tension, the Millers were asked if they would vacate the house temporarily while a more invasive forensic sweep was conducted. To the department's relief, they agreed. Donna looked exhausted by then, her voice thin, face drawn. Michael didn't say much. He just nodded and began packing overnight bags for the children. That night they stayed at Dana's sister's place across town, and the Miller residence was officially placed under full lockdown, accessible only to law enforcement and authorized technicians. Outside, reporters lingered across the street. Neighbors stood silently behind storm doors. The community that once knew each other by name now exchanged only wary glances. Inside, the crawl space sat untouched, quiet behind its old drywall and shadows. Technicians left small motion-triggered sensors in the basement and rechecked ventilation routes. Every square foot of the home was mapped, photographed, and scanned. And still, Emily's name remained on the top of the whiteboard in the precinct's case room, circled in red, with a time and date frozen beside it. But beneath the silence and stalled scans, there was a growing unease no equipment could measure. A feeling that if she had been there, if the dogs were right, someone had gone to great lengths to make sure she wouldn't be found, and that if they didn't push harder soon, whatever was left behind might vanish next. 9 days had passed since Emily Carter vanished from the Miller home, and the investigation had entered the stage that detectives quietly refer to as decay, not of evidence, but of momentum. Leads were thinning. Public interest was beginning to shift. Even the scent markers the cadaver dogs had once alerted to in the basement had faded to uncertainty. The crawl space behind the basement wall still loomed large in everyone's mind, but without concrete forensic evidence, no judge would sign off on tearing it open completely. That changed on day 9, when something surfaced not through logic or legal pressure, but through a routine procedural sweep meant to rule things out, not reveal them. A demolition crew was called in, not because police believed a body would be found, but because they needed a clean wall-to-stud inspection of the basement's west side. With the Millers still staying at Dana's sister's home and the forensic team in full control of the residence, they decided to proceed with panel removal. The drywall section in question sat between 2 storage shelves in the far corner, exactly where the dogs had paused earlier in the week. The wall looked ordinary, with a coat of eggshell paint and old scuff marks where furniture had once leaned. But once the first panel was removed, it became clear something wasn't right. Behind the drywall, stuffed between pink insulation and a hollow pocket of old framing, was a silver object wedged deep into the fluff. One of the crew members spotted it first. He called it in immediately. The technicians handling the site froze all other activity and contacted the lead investigator. Within the hour, Detective Lang and the forensics team had sealed off the basement again and brought in evidence handlers. What they pulled from that space was unmistakable. A silver bracelet, delicate, engraved on the inside, broken into 2 pieces at the clasp. The engraving was partially obscured by dirt, but still legible. E.C. It was Emily's. Her mother confirmed it without hesitation. She had given it to Emily on her 16th birthday. It had been custom-made, a single charm bracelet with a small heart-shaped plate bearing her initials. Emily never took it off. It wasn't something she switched out or rotated. She wore it to school, to babysitting jobs, and even in the shower. And now, 9 days after she was last seen, it was buried inside the wall of the home she vanished from. The forensic team treated it like a major crime scene, because it was. They photographed the surrounding insulation, took samples from the drywall fragments, vacuumed particulates from the framing edges, and gently bagged the bracelet in 2 separate evidence pouches. The area around the find was carefully scraped back. What they noticed next deepened the mystery. The insulation behind the bracelet had been disturbed, fibers were misaligned, and the interior surface of the wood framing had a thin layer of newer dust, just barely. Distinguishable under UV light, one technician put it plainly in his report. The object appears to have been inserted recently, not left during construction. Forensic testing of the bracelet confirmed it. Along the inside curve of the clasp were traces of blood, microscopic but measurable. DNA analysis later matched it to Emily Carter with 99.9% certainty. The blood had begun to degrade, indicating exposure to environmental conditions, but hadn't been there long enough to suggest years of dormancy. This wasn't evidence of an old accident or forgotten injury. It was fresh. It meant 2 things. Someone had possession of the bracelet after Emily vanished, and someone placed it behind the wall intentionally. The timing, the placement, the odd freshness of the hiding spot, none of it made sense to investigators unless they accepted a disturbing possibility. Someone was tampering with the scene. Someone with access to the home after the police had already started their investigation. It reopened a question that had been quietly circulating but never voiced publicly. Was someone close to the case trying to manipulate the outcome? The Millers were questioned again, separately this time. Both denied knowing anything about the bracelet or its appearance. They had been out of the house since day 5. The timeline, however, raised another concern. The bracelet hadn't been there when the dogs first alerted near the crawl space. It had to have been placed after day 3, possibly as late as day 8, but the house had been locked, monitored, and secured. Entry logs were reviewed and nothing irregular was found. Still, someone had managed to place that bracelet inside the wall. And if it had been planted, why? Detectives considered whether it was a misdirection, a breadcrumb meant to create noise in a case that had stalled. But if so, it was a strange and risky move. Whoever did it had intimate knowledge of the house and a specific reason to return. That raised another hypothesis. Maybe the bracelet hadn't been planted at all. Maybe it had always been inside the wall, and the dogs had smelt it the first time. Maybe Emily had been there. Maybe she had bled inside that space. Maybe something far worse had occurred just inches from where search teams stood days before, and they simply hadn't cut deep enough. Detective Lang authorized a full removal of the remaining west wall, every board, every panel, every stud. If someone had hidden that bracelet, they might have hidden more. Or worse, they might have been watching the investigation unfold, waiting to see how close anyone would get before the truth had to be moved again. In the days following the discovery of Emily Carter's bracelet behind the basement wall, the investigation shifted from a missing person search to something far more focused and far more unsettling. The bracelet had changed everything. It was no longer about whether Emily had been in the Miller home the night she vanished. That had been answered. Now the question was, who knew she had been there, and why had someone tried to bury the evidence after she was gone? Investigators began combing through every element of the Millers' property records, renovation histories, permits, and any changes made to the house in the past year. What they found didn't immediately point to guilt, but it introduced a new layer of deception. The lead came from a permit office in Center County. A clerk, responding to a routine inquiry about any recent renovations tied to the Miller property, found an application filed 5 weeks prior, an informal request submitted by Michael Miller to make non-structural changes to the basement. The request hadn't been officially approved, and no inspections were logged. It was the kind of paperwork homeowners often filed and then abandoned or simply ignored. But what caught the attention of investigators wasn't the application itself. It was the date. The document had been submitted 10 days before Emily vanished. The language in the form was vague, references to minor concrete repairs, reconfiguration of shelving, and installing new utility flooring. That might have been dismissed as routine upkeep until a second document surfaced. A handwritten invoice from a local contractor named Blake Norris, dated just 3 days after the permit was submitted, showed a line item for basement slab removal and partial re-pour. Total labor billed, $1,450. The address listed was the Millers. Detectives paid Norris a visit the next morning. He worked solo, drove a beat-up white truck with rusted ladders strapped to the top, and had a quiet reputation in town for being reliable, if a little scattered. At first, he didn't even remember the job. When shown the invoice, though, the details returned quickly. Yes, he'd worked at the Miller place. Yes, it was just a 2-day job. On day 1, he helped break up a 4-by-6-foot section of the basement slab. The area had hairline cracks, he said, and Michael wanted to clean it up before finishing the floor. They laid new gravel and prepped the space for a pour. But on day 2, things changed. Michael told him not to come back. He said he wanted to handle the concrete himself. When pressed, Norris said it didn't raise flags at the time. Homeowners took over jobs halfway all the time. But looking back now, he admitted it was unusual. Most clients didn't spend hours sweating over concrete for what was essentially cosmetic repair. Detective Lang requested a full inventory of the concrete batch used, along with any receipts or supplier logs from local hardware stores. Sure enough, Michael had purchased 3 bags of fast-setting concrete mix, gloves, and a new trowel the morning after he dismissed Norris. The timestamp on the receipt placed him at the store at 6:42 a.m., just hours after the section of the slab had been prepped. He'd paid in cash. When confronted with the information, Michael initially claimed the renovation was meant to make the basement safer for the kids. He said he wanted to smooth out the uneven section and install a small play area. But when asked why he hadn't told Dana, why there were no proper permits filed beyond the abandoned form, and why the floor work had been kept secret even after Emily's disappearance, his answers became murky. He stated he hadn't wanted to worry his wife, that the work had been minor and rushed, and that he didn't think it was relevant. Forensic specialists returned to the house with a laser scanner and mapped out the entire basement floor. The re-poured section, measuring just under 25 square feet, stood out immediately. Not because it looked suspicious, but because of what the composition analysis later revealed. Embedded in the outer edge of the slab were tiny air bubbles inconsistent with standard pour patterns. That didn't prove anything on its own. But when they used a thermal imaging camera across the surface, the slab registered at a slightly different temperature than the rest of the floor, even hours after the ambient temperature had stabilized. It wasn't enough to secure a search warrant, not yet, but it was enough to reframe the scope of the case. Investigators began quietly consulting with structural engineers and forensic archaeologists about how to excavate the slab without compromising the potential evidence beneath. Behind closed doors, there was a growing consensus. Whatever had been poured in that corner of the basement, whatever had been hidden under that fresh layer of concrete, might be the answer to the entire case. But the deeper implication haunted every investigator on the team. If Michael Miller had truly gone into that basement alone, hours after sending the contractor away, and poured a new section of concrete, what exactly had he been trying to cover? And more importantly, had they spent the past 9 days walking just inches above the truth? Michael Miller had been questioned before, twice in fact, and both times his responses were consistent, polite, measured, appropriately concerned. He answered questions without resistance, deferred to his wife during emotional moments, and never once raised his voice or interrupted. To most of the early investigators, he came across as a man caught in something tragic, but uninvolved. But after the discovery of the bracelet and the quiet revelation about the basement renovation he'd carried out alone, things began to shift. What was once a cooperative homeowner now became something else, and what was once a missing person case had begun to press against something much darker. The third interview happened in a controlled setting. No distractions, no family present. Just Detective Lang, another officer, a recorder on the table, and a narrowing window of patience. From the outset, Michael's tone was different, not agitated, but evasive. He now claimed the renovation had started closer to the end of September, not mid-October as the invoice and receipt logs showed. When pressed about why he poured the concrete himself, he shifted the explanation again, this time saying it was cheaper and that he didn't like strangers in the house. He couldn't explain why the permit was filed but never approved, why his wife had no idea work was being done, or why the concrete batch didn't match the rest of the floor. At one point, when asked why he didn't report the bracelet when it was found, Michael simply said, "I don't know how it got there." That phrase was logged word for word in the official case file. Back at the house, forensic specialists re-examined the basement floor using a new round of tools, this time micro-resistance probes that could detect subtle differences in hardness and density across the slab. They tested dozens of points and charted the results. The re-poured section, already under suspicion, didn't just differ in texture, it showed an inconsistent spread, as if the concrete had been laid over uneven debris or had been hurried. In one corner of the slab, near a plastic shelving unit marked "New Storage," the probe readings dipped sharply, indicating a softer substrate underneath. This wasn't gravel. It was something looser, something disturbed, then covered. The next step was clear but legally sensitive. To break up the concrete, the department needed a formal search warrant. For that, they needed to prove reasonable suspicion that the floor concealed evidence related to Emily Carter's disappearance. The request was filed late Wednesday afternoon and signed by a judge the next morning under seal. Once the warrant was granted, everything accelerated. Cadaver dogs were brought in again under strict chain of custody procedures. This time, their focus was surgical. Handlers led them directly to the new storage corner, and almost instantly, the first dog sat down. No hesitation, no confusion, just a direct alert. The second dog did the same. Both fixated on a 2-by-2-foot patch of floor against the wall, just inches from where Michael had claimed to have installed new shelving for the kids' craft supplies. Investigators marked the spot with tape and called in the forensic excavation team. That afternoon, police issued a press release. It was brief, only 2 sentences, but its effect was immediate. Investigators are continuing work at the Miller residence in connection to the Emily Carter case. No further details are available at this time. By the end of the day, reporters had returned to the street outside the house. News vans lined the curb. Microphones appeared in front of neighbors' homes. The image of a sealed-off basement window, partially covered by yellow tape, was broadcast across local and national channels. Public pressure surged. Questions mounted. Had they found something? Had they known more? All along? Inside the precinct, Detective Lang reviewed every interview transcript and surveillance log again, piecing together the timeline. The day after Emily vanished, Michael had stayed home from work. He'd told his employer his daughter had a fever. That excuse had never been challenged, until now. GPS data from his phone that day was incomplete. Location services had been disabled for 4 hours, between 9:12 a.m. and 1:08 p.m. In that same time window, his receipt from the hardware store was logged. The security camera from that store showed him walking out with concrete bags in a cart and his phone in his back pocket. When they analyzed the data more closely, they noticed something chilling. The phone's accelerometer showed a spike in movement, measured as vertical force, consistent with a repeated physical motion, pouring, compacting, leveling. That data had been hiding in plain sight. The basement dig was scheduled for the following morning. A forensic team would cut through the concrete slab using diamond blade saws, extract the pieces in sections, and sift the substrate layer beneath with precision tools. No assumptions could be made, no shortcuts allowed. If something was buried there, if Emily was there, it would have to be done by the book. Still, the emotional weight among investigators was heavy. For the first time since the case began, they weren't asking whether she had left the house. They were preparing to find out what had been hidden under it. As night fell over Maple Hollow, the neighborhood stood still again. Porch lights glowed softly. Reporters whispered updates into phones. And inside the cordoned-off basement, just below a piece of shelving labeled storage, the air was thick with silence until the first hammer struck the edge of the slab. The basement excavation began at 7:43 a.m. on a Friday. The forensic team worked in silence, their movements methodical, every cut of the concrete marked, every section cataloged. The room had been cleared the night before, shelving removed, flooring covered in protective tarp, all tools staged nearby. This wasn't guesswork anymore. This was recovery. The concrete slab beneath the shelving unit had shown enough irregularities to warrant a full dig, and the cadaver dogs had made their position clear. Now, it was just a matter of how deep the truth went. The first cut took over an hour. The slab was thicker than expected, nearly 6 inches, and the concrete inside showed multiple layers, one of which had hardened too quickly, creating a ripple of air pockets along the base. At 9:12 a.m., a technician using a trowel paused and signaled for the team to stop. Embedded just beneath the final layer of concrete was a thin layer of black tarp. Not old, not construction grade, just enough to act as a barrier. Carefully, the team began peeling it back. What they uncovered beneath it silenced the room. Wrapped in a second layer of plastic, folded tightly around, itself was the partial outline of a body. Female, small frame. The plastic had been cinched with twine at the top and bottom. There was no mistaking what they were looking at. It was Emily Carter. Her body had been buried just inches below where investigators had stood nearly a week earlier. A call was made to the coroner, another to the precinct, and then one final call to the officers stationed outside Dana Miller's sister's house. At 11:17 a.m., Michael Miller was placed under arrest for obstruction, unlawful disposal of human remains, and suspicion of second-degree murder. The body was transported under police escort to the county medical examiner's office. There, the formal autopsy confirmed what many feared. Emily had sustained a blunt force injury to the back of her head, likely from a fall or single impact with a flat object. The trauma had caused internal bleeding and rapid unconsciousness. No defensive wounds were found on her hands or arms, no ligature marks, no signs of prolonged struggle. According to the examiner, the death was quick, but not necessarily immediate. time of death was estimated between 9:30 and 10:15 p.m. on the night she vanished. Inside the Miller residence, detectives launched a second forensic review, this time focusing on the home's integrated smart system. Like many modern homes, the Millers had a Nest thermostat, connected door sensors, and a basic smart lighting schedule. Previously, those logs had seemed uneventful, but now that they had a fixed window of time and a confirmed suspect, the data told a different story. At 9:46 p.m. on the night of Emily's disappearance, the thermostat recorded a manual override. The temperature dropped from 71 to 65 degrees, a change that would lower ambient scent circulation and potentially slow decomposition. Just 5 minutes later, the basement door sensor registered a single open-close sequence. That alone wasn't strange. What was strange was what came after. Between 10:05 and 10:42 p.m., the system recorded no activity. Not on any doors, not on any motion sensors, not on any connected devices. A dead zone. Then, at 10:43, the front door opened. That was the Millers returning home from the charity event. The implications were devastating. In the space of roughly 1 hour, Michael Miller had lured Emily into the basement, struck her, or allowed her to fall, and buried her beneath concrete. He'd done it in a window so tight, so impossibly narrow, it defied belief. And yet, the data backed it up. His phone, during that window, was untouched. No calls, no texts, no steps logged. Just silence. He had prepared for it. When confronted with the findings, Michael initially refused to speak. His attorney invoked his right to remain silent, but the evidence didn't need his cooperation. The bracelet is behind the wall. The re-poured slab, the receipts, the contractor's testimony, the dogs, and now the body. It wasn't a case of whether he was guilty. It was a case of what he had intended. And why? Emily's family was notified later that day. Her mother collapsed in the kitchen. Her father, who hadn't spoken publicly since the second press conference, walked out into the yard and sat down on the curb for over an hour, staring at nothing. The pain wasn't just that she had died. It was that she had died right there, inside a home where she had felt safe. And no one had heard a thing. The press release came that evening. The words were brief, clinical, and emotionless. Authorities have recovered the body of 17-year-old Emily Carter from the Miller residence. An arrest has been made. The investigation is ongoing. But behind those words was a community in shock, a family broken, and a house that would never be the same. And in the center of it all, buried in silence, in cement, in fear, was the question they still hadn't answered. How long had Michael Miller planned this? As the investigation progressed and the evidence mounted against Michael Miller, a darker, more disturbing narrative began to emerge, one that went beyond the physical crime scene and delved into the secret shadows of the household. Neighbors, friends, and even the Miller children's close relatives were shocked when detectives disclosed a critical new piece of information uncovered during the forensic audit of the home's electronics and digital devices. Emily Carter had not only been a babysitter in the Miller home, she'd been an unwilling witness to something sinister. Months before her disappearance, during a previous babysitting shift, Emily had discovered hidden cameras installed in the basement. These were not the kind of surveillance devices a family might install for security or baby monitoring. They were small, almost invisible, strategically placed to record the basement stairs and laundry area, where Emily often spent time with the children. The cameras had no visible lights or alerts, making their presence easy to miss. But Emily noticed something was wrong. She saw the lenses reflecting in the dark and spotted the cables running behind the baseboards. At first, she'd assumed it was a prank or part of a home security system her employers hadn't told her about. But a closer look revealed the footage was being recorded continuously, and the data was stored on a small, encrypted hard drive locked away in a cabinet in the master bedroom closet, under Michael Miller's direct control. Emily had confronted Mr. Miller privately about the cameras a week before she vanished. She told him she had found them, and warned that if he didn't remove them, she would have no choice but to tell his wife. Michael's initial response was denial, then anger, then desperate attempts at persuasion. He assured Emily the recordings were harmless, claimed they were intended to monitor for intruders, and begged her not to tell Dana. But Emily was resolute. She felt violated, frightened, and trapped. Those cameras, she believed, were an invasion of privacy on a level that crossed boundaries no employer should cross, especially someone trusted with children. According to interviews with her close friends and family, Emily began acting anxious and withdrawn in the days leading up to her disappearance. She even spoke to a counselor about boundaries and safety, though she never revealed the full extent of what she'd uncovered. On the night she vanished, investigators now believe that Michael Miller saw an opportunity and a threat. After the Millers left for the charity event, he called Emily downstairs under the pretext of showing her the ongoing renovations, wanting to distract or intimidate her. The basement, already re-poured in sections and half-finished, became the setting for a confrontation that quickly spiraled into violence. In the tight, dimly lit space near the freshly laid concrete, a struggle unfolded. Emily tried to escape. The bracelet, a constant companion on her wrist, caught on a piece of exposed rebar or a wooden stud during the tussle and snapped. The silver charm fell to the floor, an accidental break that would become a crucial clue. In panic and fury, Michael struck her. The impact to the back of her head caused rapid unconsciousness and then death. There was no defense, no struggle after that initial moment. The rest was concealment. When the bracelet was found days later behind the drywall, forensic analysts theorized it had not been hidden immediately. Instead, Michael had initially buried it with Emily's body, a desperate attempt to keep all evidence in one place. But as the investigation closed in, he panicked again. Removing the bracelet and slipping it behind the insulation was a calculated move to mislead investigators, to separate the most identifiable piece of jewelry from the grave itself, buying time and sowing doubt. The bracelet's dual presence, first at the gravesite, then in the wall, became emblematic of the layers of deception woven into this case. For the Miller family, the revelation shattered any illusions of innocence or ignorance. Donna Miller's tearful statements in court reflected not only grief, but betrayal. The husband she thought she knew had been living a double life, watching, recording, and ultimately silencing a young girl entrusted to their care. As public awareness grew, the story took on a life of its own. The media painted the portrait of a predator disguised as a devoted father and husband. Investigators noted that such cases, where abusers hide in plain sight, are tragically common, but each instance still hits a community like a shockwave. For Emily's family, the betrayal was personal and devastating. They held vigil outside the courthouse during Michael's arraignment, candles flickering in the cold evening air as they demanded justice, not only for their daughter, but for every young person silenced by fear. Meanwhile, legal proceedings moved forward with a steady focus on the facts uncovered in the basement. The hidden cameras were cataloged as key pieces of evidence, alongside the broken bracelet and the forensic proof of the re-poured concrete. Prosecutors painted a chilling narrative: a man who used his position of trust to violate and ultimately kill, then attempted to cover his crimes with layers of concrete, drywall, and lies. The basement, once a place of routine chores and childcare, had become a prison, a dark chamber where innocence was stolen and a life was ended. And for those who knew Emily, the final reckoning was both heartbreaking and necessary. The bracelet, broken in two, now rested in evidence, a silent testament to a struggle that cost a young life but could not erase the truth. Michael Miller's confession came quietly, but carried the full weight of the devastating truth that had haunted Maple Hollow for weeks. After relentless investigation, mounting forensic evidence, and unyielding pressure, Miller chose to accept a plea deal, admitting to his role in the murder of Emily Carter. In the solemn courtroom, with his voice low and expression vacant, he detailed the terrible sequence of events he had desperately tried to hide: the secret filming, the confrontation in the basement, the panicked attack, and the calculated effort to bury not only a young life, but the truth itself beneath concrete and walls. His confession was both a release and a shattering blow for everyone who had been searching for answers. The courtroom was heavy with silence as prosecutors laid out the details, each piece of evidence intertwining to form a grim narrative of betrayal and abuse. Emily, the bright teenager entrusted to care for the Miller children, had been violated in the very home she thought was safe. The cameras, the broken bracelet, the hidden grave, all spoke to a pattern of control and fear. Michael Miller's confession did not undo the damage. It only made the heartbreak more palpable. For the family, the admission was a double-edged sword, relief that the nightmare was nearing closure, but anguish that the truth had come at such a high cost. Outside the courthouse, Emily's family and the Maple Hollow community gathered to grieve, to mourn the loss of a life full of promise, and to begin the slow, painful process of healing. A memorial service was held in the town's community center, where candles were lit, flowers were laid, and stories of Emily's kindness and dreams were shared. Friends and neighbors spoke softly of a girl who loved her family, who was thoughtful and determined, whose laughter had filled so many rooms now silent. The memorial was both a celebration of her life and a somber acknowledgement of the cruelty that had cut it short. There was no easy comfort, but the gathering served as a vital reminder that Emily's spirit endured beyond the walls where she was taken from them. Meanwhile, the Miller home, the site of so much pain and betrayal, became a focal point for closure and justice. By court order, the house was scheduled for demolition, a physical erasure of the place that had hidden such darkness beneath its surface. For the community, it was a symbolic act, tearing down the walls that concealed a terrible secret, allowing a new chapter to begin without the weight of tragedy haunting every corner. The process was slow and deliberate, carried out under police supervision to preserve any remaining evidence. Each brick and board taken down was a step toward reclaiming the space for healing rather than horror. The story of Emily Carter quickly transcended the small town. National media outlets picked up the case, spotlighting the disturbing intersection of hidden abuse, digital surveillance, and the illusion of safety within familiar spaces. News reports explored how the presence of hidden cameras, a violation of privacy and trust, had led to a confrontation that no one could have predicted. The case sparked critical conversations about the dangers lurking behind closed doors, the importance of listening to young voices, and the urgent need to protect those who are most vulnerable. Experts weighed in on how seemingly normal households can harbor dark secrets, and how community vigilance and swift action can make the difference between life and death. As the months passed, Emily's story became a catalyst for change in Maple Hollow. Local schools implemented new programs on digital safety and emotional well-being. Neighborhood watch groups strengthened their networks, sharing resources and encouraging open dialogue. The community's response was one of collective resolve to honor Emily's memory by preventing such tragedies from happening again. In the midst of the grief and upheaval, a small, profound symbol remained: Emily's silver bracelet. After being recovered from the basement wall where it had been hidden to mislead investigators, the bracelet underwent careful restoration. Its delicate charms and engraved initials were preserved as a testament to the girl who had worn it every day, never imagining it would become a key to uncovering the truth about her disappearance. In a quiet moment of remembrance, the bracelet was placed on the wrist of Emily's younger sister. This act carried deep meaning, an unbroken bond between siblings, a gesture of resilience, and a promise that Emily's life and story would never be forgotten. The bracelet, now shining softly against the younger sister's skin, became a symbol of hope amidst the darkness. It reminded everyone that even in the face of unimaginable loss, family and community could find strength in memory and justice. Emily's legacy was no longer just the tragic story that unfolded behind closed doors. It was also the courage to speak out, the power of truth, and the enduring love that could not be buried. As the sun set over Maple Hollow, the house that once concealed a terrible crime lay in ruins, but the spirit of a young girl who was taken too soon lived on, restored in the hearts of those who knew her, in the lessons learnt, and in the bracelet worn proudly by her sister, shining like a quiet beacon of remembrance and resilience.